We're live from the 66th International Festival of Creativity in Cannes, France, on the JW Marriott Terrace for Microsoft Advertising. I'm Jeffrey Colon, the head of Brand Studio, and we are joined today with Patrick Givens, Vice President and head of Vayner Smart at Vayner Media. Great to have you here.
Thanks for having me. Yeah, it's awesome.
You're a voice guy. You've been talking about it quite a bit. You're really into conversational design. Yet we don't see too many sessions on voice this year. What is it that marketers really need to understand about voice that we could at least tell them on this podcast if they're not going to hear it in any of the sessions?
I think it's an interesting time right now for us in voice where we're just cresting to that point of, device adoption. We got a little north of a quarter, I should say, of U.S. households with a device already installed. And so we're getting to that scale of usage. People are out there using it, but we're also just developing experience design principles that make sense here. Effectively, we've got, with, 18 months of track record at this point now, a bunch of first experiments in what the experience design for voice can look like, starting to get second and third iterations, some learnings building up, but nowhere near that history of what our best practices even in this space is going to look like. And so as agencies try to provide the service, they're shooting blind, as are a lot of us. And I think what we're really trying to do here is relearn some of those lessons that we had to learn in other channels. It's just fundamentally different than producing an ad and broadcasting it out. We're building a product, for lack of a better word. We're building an interactive experience. It's got to be good enough for people to want to use it. And so I think what we're learning here are things like move towards situational design frameworks, where it's a little bit less of this traditional phone tree menu style, and instead being ready for the way people actually speak and to answer those questions a little more fluid in what we can take in and where we can go from with some next steps. We're learning about what models work and therefore then able to invest a little more in the production as well. So what does it look like when you play between the voice of the platforms and recorded audio? What does sound design look like for these channels? It's all these different tools for us as creators, as people who are wanting to design and come up with really cool experiences, that it's so much fun to play with, but we also just don't have the decades of history in them to be, I would say, as sure as we might be in some of the other media that might be a little more established, a little more of a track record there, but also at this point we're just seeing has a harder time breaking through, has a hard time reaching people.
Now, I read a really interesting article this past week in The Guardian about what's called the democratization of basically audio, where you now really can't escape it. I mean, if you think about it, we have a bunch of noise behind us right now. We can't escape that unless we put earlids on. And biologically, we weren't created with earlids. We were created with eyelids, but not earlids. How do we control basically what people are putting into their ears in terms of, are we going to get to a near future where near field communication, Bluetooth, and voice, converge, and we have a bunch of people walking around New York City saying, move out of the way, pick this up later, and talking like robots?
I think there's a lot packed into that question, a lot of interesting pieces to it. So let's start with, if you're in an audio-first media, at least, even if it's primarily audio and you might have some visual secondary, what's the role of ads? What's the role of paid product there? Something that absolutely as an industry we're still trying to figure out, because it's not the same as written text and imagery where you can have something adjacent to the core content. You've got position one or none, really. And so are you going to interrupt the content experience? You're going to interrupt the interactive experience to throw a branded message in there? Be a pretty bad experience. We're trying to, I think, work out what is the role for some promotional model in here, but I don't think it can totally sacrifice what people are actually asking for if they're asking a question of an assistant and hoping to get an answer. You've also got, what's the quality of that experience design going to be? So again, in this model now where we don't have ad products in platform, what we're actually trying to build are experiences people are asking for rather than necessarily the mass scale content that we can push out in other channels across social elsewhere. I think what we're looking at now is this kind of confluence of, it's spreading. We have, I walk around, if I'm in New York, probably spend half the day with AirPods in, and I'm going through my day, and absolutely, what does audio AR start to look like? Location-based audio where we're augmenting surroundings with that can be super useful, super interesting. It could also be really intrusive and a pretty bad experience if we aren't thoughtful about what we're building.
Yeah. We're here with Patrick Gibbons, Vice President, Head of Vayner Smart at Vayner Media on the Disruptive FM podcast, sponsored by Microsoft Advertising. Now let's pivot for a second here, Patrick. Yeah. Let's talk about another theme that is talked about almost every single year at Cannes, and that is the agency model. Now, recently Business Insider talked about how VaynerX is going to be sort of this holding company of the future that basically Gary Vee is going to lead by changing the entire model.
Yeah, sounds right.
Talk a little bit more about this, because this is something obviously the other holding companies are probably not ready for. And every year there's always conversations on, how do we control what's going to happen here? What is this sort of model that you're building?
Sure. So it's correct to say VaynerX is a holding company, right? We are a collection of different businesses that are kind of orchestrated and collected around this modern marketing agenda, whatever you would call that. And so that's Gallery Media Group, a publishing arm with websites like PureWow, 1:37 p.m., as well as a podcast publishing arm. That's Tracer, where we're doing kind of cross-platform analytics and really trying to ensure there's accountability into where the media goes. And it's Vayner Media itself, which is actually even a bit more integrated on that agency side with the strategy and creative, but also production and media all under one roof and all really working hand in glove, working closely together. And so I think sometimes when I hear holding company, what it says to me is collection of companies that are potentially never actually speaking to one another, that are, yes, in some way affiliated on a business level, might join pitches together, but not in the iterative working relationship that I'd say is what we have today across the VaynerX network. And specifically, I'll say I work very closely with the Gallery Media Group team, though I'm a division of Vayner Media. Different companies, we sit on the same floor in the same building, walk back and forth. It's not a series of meetings scheduled to get anything accomplished. It's going over and chatting to somebody. And I think if you don't have that speed back and forth, that close, not only personal relationship, but actually physical relationship, if you're not in the same place, you're not going to get the serendipity of hearing about a new podcast that's coming up and me sitting next to the team and saying, hey, you know what? If you're going to be shooting a bunch of video and recording a bunch of audio, maybe that's also an interactive voice experience. Maybe there's a natural extension there. So in terms of when we say holding company, that's what this is. And then I think even more to your point about this model of the future question, it gets pretty interesting for me because frankly, what Gary's doing in this isn't reported on a quarterly basis to a holding company that we have to report earnings to, and so it allows for some longer-term planning and longer-term thinking. I think my division is a case study in that because no fiscally conservative holding company who was really counting on a quarterly basis would have invested 3.5 years ago in an innovations group meant to figure out if there was something to do in voice for brands and meant to see, what is connected packaging going to mean? When Gary and I first started talking about this, it was a feel on his side that the Internet of Things, in the broadest definition of that term, was going to matter for the way that brands were discovered, that products were bought and used, and there was something in there. There was something in all these new connected digital touch points coming around that was really going to matter for marketing. We didn't quite know what it was. We didn't know what our product was. We had to build product market fit and all the rest of this. And that's been coming up on now a 4-year project that we're continuing, but it also allowed us to be very early in the voice space and be in close partnerships with some big platforms. It allowed us to do some big connected packaging plays. We're fortunate enough to get something in market with Ritz Crackers this year. It's actually up for some of the Lions here. And it's been really exciting to get some of these big, somewhat ambitious programs in place. And for us, it's a learning experience on how to design for these new channels. And it's also a constant assessment of, is this something, a capability that when marketing for our own brands, those that we acquire, those that we build ourselves in-house and launch, that we need to have to make sure those are successful in the future. That's really the lens through which we view where we place our emphasis.
Patrick Gibbons, Vice President, Head of Vayner Smart at Vayner Media. Thanks for joining us on the Disruptive FM podcast.
Thanks for having me.
You've been listening to Disruptive FM with Microsoft's Head of Brand Studio, Jeffrey Colon.